go again. From 1677, every officer in the Royal Navy has had to pass an examination which showed that they actually knew their trade. But before the Victorian era, how they learned that trade was their problem. Most learned on the job. They'd join a ship, often captained by somebody their family knew, and they worked as a captain's servant. A lucky few would be given instruction by the captain and his officers. The rest would pick up things based on what they saw everybody else was doing. There were even some who weren't on the ship at all. Their parents had worked out a deal with the captain, so the boy was there only on paper. The captain pocketed his pay, and the lad racked up a few years of sea time without ever having to get his feet wet. As you might imagine, this wasn't the best way of training a young officer. So, in 1729, the Royal Navy Academy was set up in Portsmouth. Lads between the ages of 13 and 16 received between 2 and 3 years of instruction there, before being sent out into the fleet. However, they did not get rid of the old system of captain servants. They just got rid of some more corrupt practices and made sure the boys were actually on board. Flag officers were even allowed to continue keeping a few after the reforms of 1794 that added more structure to the number of boys on board. After these reforms, about 20% of the boys on a ship were young gentlemen destined to become officers. These were given the rating of volunteer in the ship's books. There were other lads on board, most destined to become sailors, and they were rated as boys, along with a handful of servants for officers of flag rank. Then in 1837, the Naval College was shut down. It had only been producing 40 midshipmen a year, and that just wasn't enough to supply the growing fleet. So they decided to concentrate entirely on the volunteers training in the fleet. Now nothing mattered other than moving in the correct social circles to get you on a good ship. All ships carrying volunteers and midshipmen were supposed to carry a schoolmaster, but in the smaller ships there was simply not enough room. Anybody on these ships had to rely on what the officers taught them, and as a result, many failed their exams. With all of those mids failing their examinations, something needed to change. So, in 1856, all officers would be trained as cadets on board a training ship. They all had to pass the same entrance examination in order to secure their place, and the ship chosen was HMS Britannia, and she was moored on Hanslow Creek in Portsmouth Harbour. One of the earliest cadets to join was Lord Charles Beresford, with his great rival, Jackie Fisher, being one of the final products of the old system. Beresford was the second son of the 4th Marquess of Waterford, but on board Britannia he would have found himself sharing a mess with the sons of doctors, businessmen and the rest of the middle classes. These boys would have normally gone to the kind of private school which in Britain is called a public school, because Britain is strange like that. And that was what Britannia was modelled on. This left many officers that passed through it feeling that they had too much cramming and rote learning, so that their professional education only really began once they got out into the real world. This wasn't the only way that Britannia emulated the public schools. It had a strict uniform, and some of the lads were even given a taste of responsibility by being placed in charge of the younger boys. In a public school, these would have been called prefects, but on board Britannia, they were called cadet captains. Beresford was made a cadet captain, but he was demoted again the same day after celebrating by emptying the contents of a bread bin over the master-at-arms and then hanging around long enough to get caught. Despite antics like this, Britannia was trying to mould these 13-year-olds into young gentlemen, and Portsmouth was not considered the best place to do that. By 1861, there were discussions as to where the establishment should be moved to. A permanent college on Hayling Island was proposed, as was building something on Portland. However, instead of paying that much, the ever-stingy Admiralty decided simply to tow the existing Britannia somewhere else. The location they chose was Portland. But after they got there, they discovered it wasn't particularly good either. So, in 1863, Britannia moved again. This time, she went to the River Dart and was moored upstream from the small town of Dartmouth. This was to become a permanent home, and there were soon 300 cadets training on board. The number of cadets continued to increase, and in 1864, Britannia was joined by Hindustan to provide additional accommodation. Then, in 1869, the original Britannia was replaced by a larger vessel. This had originally been called HMS Prince of Wales, but it took on the name HMS Britannia as the old Britannia was towed away. This ship was modified for her new task. Her engine and boiler were removed, the poop was raised, extended and roofed in, 2 of her masts were removed, a library and lecture rooms were installed, as well as electric lighting. The younger lads slept on Hindustan, with the older ones had their quarters on the new Britannia. The Navy hoped that by separating them, they could reduce the chance of bullying. It did still happen, but if it was found, it was punished severely. In 1874, a cadet was discovered bullying another cadet. He was awarded a birching as a punishment. This meant being hit with a bundle of sticks, which looks a bit like the end of a witch's broom. This might sound extreme to us, but it was a common punishment used in public schools at the time. It was certainly better than being dismissed from the service, as happened in 1891 when 4 cadets were discovered trying to extort money from one of the junior cadets. However, matters like this rarely reached the point of needing an official punishment. Most gunroom matters were settled in the gunroom, and this continued once they got out to sea. The sub-lieutenant in charge of the gunroom often carried a cane known as a Benjamin, and he used that to inflict a quick and memorable reminder should any young gentleman forget where he was. But this is not to say that the gunroom was a tyranny. A bully could find himself put before a gunroom court-martial and awarded some of the same. While Britannia was changing, the Navy itself was also changing. The middle class had been rising throughout the Victorian period, but has been squeezed out of the Navy. At the beginning of the 20th century, the officer corps was drawn almost exclusively from the upper levels of British society. Partly this was due to changes in the rules. Candidates had to be of pure European descent with British parents on both sides. But the Navy had another way to make sure its officers came from the correct social class: money. A naval officer was not expected to be financially self-sufficient until the age of 21, 9 years into his career. The cost of going to Dartmouth barred 95% of Britain's population from even trying to get a commission. The Admiralty did not even try to deny that they were using financial barriers to block people from becoming cadets. You had to pay for your training, you also had to pay for your uniform, and this accounted for 1/4 of the cost of a total cost of a cadet's training. Nothing other than the uniform was allowed, and anything else would be returned to their parents. They're still required to keep to the college's dress code today, even when they're in civvies, and you can always play Spot the Cadet on a night out in Dartmouth. However, the Navy was not just looking for money. These cadets might not be shoveling coal all day, but they still need to be physically fit. And so, they needed to pass medical. Once they would prove they were fit, Britannia had large playing fields for various sports to keep them fit. From 1878, they even added a pack of beagles for those cadets who preferred hunting rabbits to playing rugby. Despite what you might think from the actions of certain officers, yes, Admiral Milne, I am looking at you, the fourth and final thing that a potential cadet needed was intelligence. I've already mentioned the entrance examination, but of course there was also an interview so that the Admiralty could weed out clever applicants who spoke with the wrong accent. Another thing that was going on at the beginning of the 20th century was that the old ships were coming to the end of their lives. The Navy did not have the reserve of hulks that it had had in the 1860s, so this time it had no choice other than to splash out on a stone frigate. The last cadets left the old Britannia on September 9th, 1905, while the new purpose-built college was still being finished. They spent a few months living on cruisers based at Bermuda before the new building was opened in January of 1906. I've sailed past it many times. Personally, I like Sir Aston Webb's design. But not everybody agreed. A booklet from Gives, the naval tailor, describes it as reminding them as a mixture of a prison, the house of a profiteer, or a lunatic asylum. Another change was that after passing the entrance examination at 14, the cadet would not be sent straight to Britannia. Instead, they began their training at Queen Victoria's old home on the Isle of Wight, Osborne Palace. They would spend their first terms at Osborne before moving on to Dartmouth. The cadets here lived by a large number of petty rules, such as having to double pass the gunrooms of more senior cadets and being forbidden to look inside. The gunrooms were what would be called dormitories anywhere else, and if a lad had looked into one of these forbidden windows, he would have been a bit disappointed. Each was just a series of beds, and at the foot of each bed there was a large chest that they kept their clothes in. Failure to keep it neat meant a chest strafe. Early to the dormitory, folding and refolding your uniform until it was perfect. Despite the Admiralty's best efforts to prevent people from the wrong social class from entering the wardroom, they could only tack against the winds of change for so long. In 1912, a scheme was initiated to allow petty officers to achieve a commission. Rutland of Jutland, the pilot who would achieve a DSO for his actions at the Battle of Jutland, gained his commission this way, having started his career as a boy rating. A year later, in 1913, the Admiralty also set up the Special Entry Scheme. This was for lads of 17 to join Britannia from a public school, rather than from Osborne. These small reforms proved quite enough for the Admiralty, who did not want any more change if they could help it. The Special Entry Cadets, known as pubs, had their initial training at Keyham, near the docks in Plymouth. Once they got to Dartmouth, they were seen as a breed apart and were kept separate from the Darts, who had entered the normal way. They were housed in a disused barracks at Sand Key, rather than in the main dormitories of the college itself, but they were also given a lot more freedom. They could smoke, buy a pint, and they were treated a lot more like adults than schoolboys. In 1939, one of these pubs was Prince Philip of Greece, the future Duke of Edinburgh and husband of Queen Elizabeth II. Dartmouth was where they first met, and she invited the handsome young gentleman for tea on board the royal yacht. He went on to win the King's Dirk as the most promising cadet, and will be mentioned in dispatches for his bravery at the Battle of Matapan during World War II. Since then, things had changed further. Everybody now reaches Britannia like one of the pubs of Prince Philip's time, or by rising from the lower deck like Rutland. And next time I'll be talking about how sailors were recruited for the lower deck during the Victorian period.